Good morning, everybody. This is Steve Lowenthal. I'm Kineo's U.S. CEO, and glad to have everybody join us today for our webinar on architecting for results. Our VP of Design, Cami Bean, who many of you probably already know, will be facilitating the session today and taking us through a short presentation. And together we'll answer questions as we move through. So please use the questions window in the control panel to ask your questions as we go. We're happy to interject them as we move through the presentation. So just as a brief introduction, as an industry, we've been a lot of attention has been spent over the last several years on how do we better engage learners. And I think that has a lot of value and certainly an area we've spent time on. But it prompted a bigger question for us, which is what's the outcome of that? If we're better engaging people, are we getting the results we want? Which ultimately is about learning transfer. So that started us down a path to do some research in that area and look at some best practices around learning transfer. And to today's presentation is really just sharing the outcome of that remuneration that we've been doing, and to engage you and get your input and feedback on how your best practices as well. So with that, Cami, let me hand it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Steve, and happy afternoon to everyone wherever you are. It's not my morning. I'm at noon, high noon here in Massachusetts on a beautiful spring day, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm Cami Bean. Steve and I have been with Kineo US since 2009. I'm excited to be with you all today. So as we get started, architecting for results. I want you to first imagine you're in a crowded conference room and they're sharing the performance results, and they look rather dismal for the organization. The training team's morale hits rock bottom, right? You guys, we've been working so hard. We've been putting all this good training out there to improve performance, and it's not working. We got to do something else, right? So some guy has this great idea. I know, let's create more engaging training. We're going to create better experiences. We want to make it pretty. We want to make it fun. We want to make it really fast. So we start creating games and gamification and adding a lot of elements and micro learning and really kind of amping up the whiz and the bang, right? And people love it, right? You're getting 5-star reviews as people take those exit surveys from your online learning experiences. It's fun. We've really done a great job. People are so excited and you're feeling pretty good. This is all a good sign, right? But those performance results, sorry to say, they have not changed a bit, and we're kind of still back where we started from. So what's a training team to do? How can you get better results? This is where everyone starts scratching their heads, right? And perhaps the challenge is that we need to do something a little bit different than we've been doing. You got to get that, what is that called? A ball wrecker? A wrecking ball? Get that wrecking ball out there and kind of tear things down, and we're going to do things a little bit differently. So before we get into what that just different approach is, let's take a look at some of the numbers. And this is, surveys and research that's been done by some really well-known organizations that show what's actually happening out there within training teams. So 76% of L&D functions have redesigned learning content to make it more enjoyable. This is from a CEB 2016 study. And if you have, raise your virtual hand. I don't know if GoToMeeting actually has a virtual hand. Are you out there redesigning learning content and making it more enjoyable? If so, what are you doing? Are you bumping up that engagement? Is some of what I've said earlier resonating with what you're trying to do to create something that's going to pull people in and get them to stick? 67%, this is from the same survey, 67% of L&D functions have increased the number of learning channels they utilize. Another really interesting statistic I heard, and sorry I can't give you a source for this, but I think it was a Burson report. It's like the average L&D team is now using something like 22 different tools to deliver learning within their organization, and that, it's probably a broad tool set, right? Authoring tools and platforms and different channels. But if we think about, we're trying to do things right. We're trying to get multi-channel learning out there, and we know that we can't just have things on the LMS. We've got to have things on your internal YouTube or your social network internal. We're doing a lot of things right? We're trying to really move the bar. So take a moment and think about what it is that you are doing to make things more engaging. Hopefully you've been thinking about this. And if you want to share any questions in chat, feel free to, or ask a question in the question pod. And I know Steve, what's been our experience in terms of what clients are coming to us asking us for in terms of more engagement? We're hearing a lot of requests for video, for shorter content, for games and game-like elements and gamification onto it. Anything you would add to that, Steve?
Yeah, I think if you would characterize sort of the solutions we've created over the last 3+ years and how there's been a significant change, right? They've become shorter, they become more media rich. There's more call for engagement, so whether that be interactive video or some sort of gamification, a game or there. When we've introduced, extrinsic motivation, right? So motivation through points and badges and elements like that. So you've seen all of that kind of come to the forefront over the last several years.
Yeah, and Kineo, for those who don't know, Kineo, we build a lot of custom e-learning content for organizations across a really wide spectrum. So we've been doing this for a long time, and we've seen a lot of trends come and go. And that word engagement is a big one. People always want things to be more engaging. But, the but on the other end of this is, with all of that effort, traditional training still only creates 37% results back on the job. What does that mean? That means that transfer is really not happening. People aren't applying what they have learned, and you're not seeing performance results. So we're spending a lot of energy and effort on creating all of this more engaging stuff, and yet the results are not that great. And on top of that, only 25% of CEOs think that their training programs are effective at measurably improving performance. And that's pretty significant, I think, and it's sort of depressing, right? So this is from September 2014. I'd be interested to see a more recent statistic on this. Are we doing better? Are we doing worse? Is the thumb going up or is the thumb going down in terms of this? But if CEOs, if senior stakeholders at that high level think that training really isn't improving performance, it kind of begs the question of why are they funding training programs at all yet? If they think if it's not useful, why bother? So I'd say, Houston, we have a problem. For those of us who sit in this sphere, there is a problem, and it's not a new one. I think, there's always been talk about return on investment and the ROI of learning, but when you start to see these numbers in such stark contrast to how the efforts are doing, you think there's got to be a better way. There's got to be something different that we can be doing. So what can we do? We can focus on not just on knowledge delivery, and that's what a lot of us are really good at. We're great at creating micro-learning and multi-rich video experiences and games and all that, but we need to try a different model. So this comes from Robert Brinkerhoff's Courageous Training Model. And I think what's really telling here, this during training, right? That's the event or the e-learning or whatever it is that we're creating. He's basically saying we should spend 20% of our effort on that piece, and 40% before and 40% after. And yet we often just have a laser focus on this middle row. So if we let's look at that a little bit more closely. So before training, what can we be doing differently to really get people ready to learn and to ensure that we're going to have those results back on the job? We've got to create motivation. We've got to create focus. We've got to get people aligned, have them understand, exactly why this training is going to matter to them, what's the intention of going through it. So it's kind of, marketing before you get to the training experience itself, right? Build a foundation, build some fertile ground that, think of a gardener, you've got to sow I'm going to totally mess up this metaphor, right? So you've got to get out there and you've got to till the soil and you've got to add your compost and you've got to make it ready and fertile before you even plant the seeds. And so maybe during the training is when you're planting the seeds. You're actually going through and you're teaching those skills. You're building a good learning event experience, e-learning program, applying adult learning principles. You know, you're doing all the right things, all the things that we're doing now. So that's the seed planting phase. And then after the training, we've got to follow up. We've got to water, and we've got to weed, and we've got to support real performance improvement in the workplace by keeping the messaging alive. We've got to, sometimes you might have to send out, you know, job aids and reminders. You might have to think more of it as a learning campaign where there's just more touch points happening with real people. Often we might create a learning event or have a training experience at the class, you know, in the classroom. And then nobody ever talks about it ever again. You know, you go off site to a workshop or you spend 2 hours online going through a program and it's never discussed again. We've got to make sure that we're creating those hooks back into the real world. So I'll pause there and see, Steve, do you have any add-ons to this?
Yeah, I think, you know, the context of this kind of message is interesting. I'd be curious of, you know, the attendees' point of view, which is, you know, a lot of what we hear in the market today. We hear Josh Burson talk about the invisible learning organization. We have, you know, the idea that learning should be integrated into work, and I think everybody would agree with that. But is that at the expense of more formal training programs, which is what this is addressing? How do you balance sort of what I would traditionally call development, sort of making the right resources available for people, curating resources so people can access them at the time of need, versus more deliberate change and performance improvement? And just curious how your organizations are balancing those two off today.
Well, and that juxtaposition, Steve, Steve has been writing an article that I've been helping him with, really talking about the distinction between training activities versus development activities. I think that's really the heart of what you're talking about. So there's, you know, specific skill building that we do during training, but then there's that ongoing employee development. And are they separate streams? Are they connected? Is it the same team that should be doing those? It is an interesting question.
Yeah, so and Meg brings up a great point, which we've had a little bit of experience with, which is, you know, how often do you extend the learning in the after phase? What type of strategies are effective in this phase? And it's been interesting. We've had some interesting experiences there where we've sort of hard coded in application. So you go through some learning, but then practice and application are an extended tail to that experience. And we've struggled to get organizations to embrace that. We find that it tends to work well, more senior positions. If you're going through exec ed or hypo development, organizations and individuals are willing to commit to that. We found, conversely, as you push down into an organization, there's a lot more pushback to ask frontline workers to apply things on the job, and managers in particular who you know, struggle with bandwidth. So
yeah, ain't nobody got time for that, right? It's kind of the world that we live in. It feels that way, and I think that's where a lot of these after training activities fall to the wayside. Ain't nobody got time for that. We got to get out there and do our job.
And Aubrey's I'm sorry, I was just going to pitch in. Aubrey, you know, to put a comment in. Thanks, Aubrey, that their organization's, you know, is tackling this head on, and that they've created specific roles that are between the learning team and the design team, and then leadership, and sort of, you know, trying to make that connection happen. So that's great if your organization's pushing in that direction.
So, and maybe that role that is it Aubrey was just describing is, you know, it's a learning designer role, but you're really starting to think more like a conductor and helping orchestrate activities kind of throughout this training and or development life cycle, and thinking very much more broadly. So if we have to be thinking about the before, the during, and the after, that's quite a symphony that's happening, and there's a lot of moving parts. And a lot of different players, just to just to keep that musical metaphor going. So how, so if we're moving to thinking more like conductors instead of thinking about getting training or learning content just into people's heads, this picture, this came over very well in a live session I did. It was in full color, but this is what's called a keg stand. And I had to laugh because, back in college, this was many, many years ago. I don't know if they still do keg stands, but it's all about getting a lot of beer ingested into your body in a very short amount of time, right? So this guy's standing on his head and someone's pouring the tap down. We also talk about drinking from the fire hose or, there's just, you're trying to get so much content into people's heads during this training event, but it is not recommended for either drinking or training. So we want to be, a little bit more sophisticated in our delivery. This, not this. And so how do we think about shifting, from the content itself to thinking more about the learning journey that we're taking people on? We also talk about bridging the learning doing gap, right? So there's, you go off to all your trainees march off to their classroom or sit down and take their e-learning and they're learning. But then there's this gap when you get back onto the job and the doing is not happening, that application. So that's back to that initial statistic we have, about 37%, or 34% saying that there's actually not results happening back on the job. So we talk about this learning doing gap, and that's what we want to help bridge, right? That's our goal. And that's, these conductors, we want to be thinking about bridging that learning doing gap. It sounds very, it's much more aspirational than I think we are, and that's going to be our challenge. So I'm going to take a little detour here and go on a little journey and think about learning how to drive. So back when you were a kid, and maybe you are teaching your kids how to drive now. I'm not there quite yet, but my kids are starting to count down the years until they're going to get their license. And I know Steve has just gone through this recently with his kids. So learning how to drive, it's a journey, right? And it may have been a little bumpy at times. So first off, you think about that student driver, how motivated were you? Chances are you didn't need to be convinced to go out and learn how to drive. You were all in, right? My kids are panting. When do we get to drive? It's generally, you've got a highly motivated participant. Not always, but generally, and it may depend if you live in an urban environment or a suburban environment. And then you get out there on the road and you're having your first driving class or something, and you realize, oh, this isn't so easy. And you, the student driver, realize that there's, oh shoot, this is harder than I thought. I have a gap. This is not like riding a big wheel, especially if you're driving a standard clutch, and there's just a lot to take in. And you go out and you take that required driver's ed class and you learned. I don't know that driver's ed is mandated in every single state. It is here in Massachusetts. When I was a kid, it was not mandated, but I did take private driving lessons because my dad drove me insane. My dad tried to teach me how to drive, and we put in practice time, but my dad was the one who would scream out of blue, stop. And I was supposed to stop really fast and pretend that a kid had just run into the road. And all I could do was I'd get really annoyed with him and I'd slow down very slowly and just glare at him. And then we went to formal driving lessons. But anyway, so you do your formal training, you go to your practice time on the road, and finally you took that completely terrifying road test. And perhaps you took it more than once. I did. I feel like I'm giving you a lot of true confessions today, but I had done a very good job on my test, and we're pulling into the final turn at the police station. And I had learned very well from my driving teacher that when you pull into an intersection and you're turning left across traffic, that you do not pull out until the car in front of you has gone. And then you pull out. So I did that. I watched the car in front of me, but I neglected to look at the light and see that the light had turned red. So there I am in the intersection, and the driving instructor guy is just like, "What are you doing?" So I failed my test. It was mortifying. Okay, so eventually you pass your test, and now you've got skills. But sometimes you might need to review the rules of the road. Maybe you move to a new state. Maybe you get a lot of speeding tickets and they mandate either a classroom training or online training. This poor guy actually, this is a Shutterstock photo, and it turns out he had been drunk driving. So he probably had to take a little bit of training too. So there's this whole journey here, and really this learning journey, the learning to drive journey, isn't all that different from any other learning journey. And at Kineo, we've been trying to sort of think about how can we apply this journey model to the learning experiences that we're creating. And we'll dive into this a little bit more. But really, we start thinking about it in terms of phases. And I'm going to jump over this, and we'll come back to sort of this journey model.
Yeah, I would just add,
in terms.
I was going to add,
Go ahead.
my personal anecdote is going through the driving is I have twin 16-year-olds now. And I think one of the challenges for us as learning professionals is my kids are completely different. I have a daughter who's was very confident about driving, very excited to get going, has got her license already. On the other hand, I have a son who's nervous about driving, avoids it, practicing as much as he can, who still is probably 6 months away from getting his license. So two people who demographically you would say are very similar, yet the kind of experience that's right for them is really different. So I think that's one of our big challenges we have.
And so if you think about that journey model for Steve's kids, like they're coming in what we call the engage phase, right? You've got two levels of motivation, same audience, same demographic, but one who's really eager to move, super engaged, super motivated. You don't have to convince Sarah that she needs to get out there and take her test. And yet your son is holding back. He might need to be convinced. He might need to see a need, because meanwhile, dad is still willing to drive him to lacrosse practice and soccer practice. So yeah, that's that intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So if we think about this journey, engage, and think about your own learners and the experiences that you're creating and how engaged, how motivated are they going to be? That's something to think about. So now continuing along in our driving journey, right? Our driving student identified, realized there was that oh shoot moment where I don't know as much as I think I know. And so how do we help people diagnose their current level, understand their current performance and their gaps, including their strengths and their weaknesses, right? So I need to create, I think this diagnose phase really ties back into engagement. So particularly if you're trying to help someone really understand why they need to be motivated here, you have to sometimes help them understand their gaps. And a lot of times we think, oh, I know how to do this.
Yeah,
but creating that gap.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, creating that gap awareness can be a really powerful motivator if you think you already know everything. Go on, Steve.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think we do a good job of this generally in things like leadership in particular, where diagnostics and assessments are a big part of that process. We often forget about it in other skills, and the idea that that people will, just because we have a new way for people to do things, that we assume that they recognize their current way as faulty is a really big assumption that I think gets us in trouble a lot. I think the idea that helping people recognize they have a need is a critical step that at least my experience is often gets forgotten.
Oh, I went backwards. All right, so we're moving on from diagnose, and now we're ready to learn, right? So you primed the prompt. You figured out how motivated, engaged that learner is. You help them understand their gaps, and now we go to the formal training, and you're figuring out what exactly this person needs to learn or what they need to understand. Is it knowledge or skills? Does the behavior need to change? And this is where typically we often start, right, with our learning solutions, is just this phase, right? This is where trainers are really good at, instructional designers are really good at, e-learning developers, designers good at just deciding what sort of learning solution is most appropriate, or designing it to the right models. Then we get out to practice. So here you are on the road with your dad. How are you building in practice to your traditional training experiences? And it's not just a role play in an e-learning program or in a classroom, or filling out a worksheet, or doing a show me, try me, test me of a software system. It's actual real world practice, deliberate practice back on the job. So if you're teaching someone how to deliver feedback to their team members, they need to go practice that with their actual team members. You need to get them into the real conditions and applying this content. So how can you build that kind of structure into the program that you're doing? Are you providing job aids, reference tools, performance support so that they can actually do that application once they get back onto the job? You may also need to do some kind of an assessment. So we had a formal driving test in this case before I could get my license. How are you going to determine at your organization if the desired outcome was achieved? Is there some kind of a proficiency credential, a credential that you need to earn to demonstrate that proficiency? Do you need to have someone observe you doing that task or skill? So maybe you work in food service and you're using the toaster, or you're slicing bread. Is your manager signing off that you know how to use the skill, and now you have the credential to actually use the bread slicer or whatever the piece of equipment is? I know, like a lot of OSHA requirements, we have to do that. If you're teaching someone how to use a forklift, you actually have to sign off that they can now use a forklift, and they will get certified. Finally, this is that, at the end of the day, I've got my driver's license, but I might need to be refreshed on the skills every once in a while. It could be that the laws are changing, right? Hey, no texting and driving, people. It's a law now. And we've got to keep people up to date on content and information that's changing. And we've got to reinforce the behaviors that we want people to have. I always sort of jokingly say, if you think about behavior change, like I go to the dentist every 6 months, and 2 weeks before I have to go to the dentist, you might start flossing really regularly, and then you go to the dentist and the dentist says, hey, you got to floss. And then you're really good about flossing for a little while, and then you stop flossing until it's time to go back to the dentist. At least we go to the dentist every 6 months because you keep getting that message reinforced. Because behavior change takes time, and you have to remind people. And that's why a lot of learning campaigns will keep that reinforcement going over time. So I'm going to pause there, Steve. Yeah.
Well, a couple of questions that came up. One was from Lisa, who said, that in some of their classes they do sort of assessments to understand where current performance is, but then in particular, it sounds like in the classroom setting they struggle to how do you adapt the learning then to represent to reflect where people's different starting points are. I think, Lisa, from a digital point of view, we're certainly starting to implement more tools that use some version of artificial intelligence to personalize curriculum based on people's needs and current performance. So that's certainly something that we see happening. I think even if if it's a classroom where it's more difficult to change the content you're delivering, as you structure content, you can talk to people's different starting points and needs as you work through the content is one approach, certainly. And so, Cammie, there was a question earlier which probably is appropriate to ask you now.
Okay.
Which is, Jeff is asking about the conductor role, I put in quotes, suggesting, is that the project manager rather than the instructional designer, or is it something else?
I think it's a learning architect. I mean, yeah, who sits with that role? I don't think it's a project manager role, because the learning, that conductor really needs to be thinking about that big picture. What are those before events, those during events, those after events? And as we continue, we're about to kind of talk a little bit more concretely about how to use these elements in learning design, these steps that we've gone through. And I think that's really the challenge of the learning architect or the instructional designer, to think about what are all the activities that need to be happening to support this learning need, this training need, this development need, whatever we're calling it. And the challenge is that every journey is unique. So you're going to have to be moving the dials, right? You can't have a one size fits all for every single learning solution, because every situation is a little bit different, and certainly every learner is a little bit different. We talked about Steve's two kids, his twin kids. They start from a different place. So I guess I would say it's not a project manager job unless your project manager is much more of a learning architect than an admin. And hopefully that answered that question. But so if we think about how to mix it up, because every journey is unique, what are the dials that you're going to need to set? We're going to run through a few case studies here. We have, often as we're going into a design engagement, we ask ourselves all these questions. So because we want to figure out what are the right levers, the right switches, how do we want to dial this project up, and what's the right solution for this body of content and this audience? And these are the kind of the stages that we just ran through. Engage. Will users have a compelling reason to engage? Do they want to do this? Are there barriers, obstacles for them? We kind of want to go through all of these sections and basically understand, practice. Will users need practice to succeed back on the job? Sometimes you have a learning intervention where no practice is required, and that's fine. Then you're going to you're not going to need practice. I mean, that might be if you're just communicating. It's more of a communication piece as opposed to a true behavior change or performance change. But typically, where we're trying to change performance, there may be practice involved. So you can ask yourself all of these questions and get into this for each learning engagement. And now we're going to look at some examples and just see how we dialed things differently. And Steve has something to say.
Yeah, I was just going to add, if you think about blended learning, so the approach we tend to use is to think about blends through sort of the kinds of experiences you want to create versus the kind of technology you want to apply. So if you look at any of these sort of functional or experienced types of experiences, can be executed with technology or without technology. There's lots of ways to address the need, but the key for us is let's understand the needs we're trying to address first. Technology becomes an enabler, secondary to the needs of the learner that we need to address to accomplish our end goal.
Excellent. Right. You don't want technology to be driving the horse or the cart. Or here I go with my metaphors again. You want to lead first with what is it that you need to help people be able to do, and then figure out the right technologies to support that. All right, so test drive number 1. You have the challenge of developing new frontline leaders at your organization. So this is a common problem, right? You hire up new people. Well, you hire up people who have been great individual performers, individual contributors, and now you make them the head of the team. And they have a whole team of people reporting up to them. And guess what? They've never done this before, and they don't really know what they're doing. So how do you build up the skills of new frontline leaders? So Kitio, we went through this process where we kind of figured out what were the dials for this audience group. And Steve, this is really the Management Plus model. So if you want to talk through this a little bit, and put behind some of the thinking that drove what we came up with.
Sure. So, we developed a product that helps frontline new managers develop sort of basic skills for being a frontline manager, coaching, giving feedback, managing performance. And when we went out and talked to prospective clients about what are the gaps there, we kind of got consistent feedback, which was there were some earmarks to it, which is one, people didn't apply the content very well once they learned it. So people didn't say there's an absence of good content in the market, whether it be e-learning content or live training or written material. They said there's lots of that. But how do we get people to actually do what they to put into practice what it was. So part of that design there was, application became a big part of the design. That's the long bar there, which is we hard coded in practice. So you went through some e-learning And then we actually had you go through a worksheet to say, here's someone I'm going to give feedback to. Here's the key issues I want to address. Here's the sort of process I'm going to follow, what I'm going to do in each step of the process. They went out and did it, and then they actually came back to the platform and journaled that experience. And then we actually had a manager. We have a manager role that an organization can assign to kind of coach and support people through that process.
So here you see a screenshot from the actual product that we developed, and this was one particular what we call the journey. So we're teaching people about how to delegate. So you're an individual performer and you knew how to get work done yourself, but as a frontline manager, you actually need to, tell other people what to do. Basically, you need to delegate that work. So in the prepare phase, so the whole journey was organized in terms of these phases. And I'm just going to jump back a slide or two. So engage, diagnose, that's really part of that prepare phase. So we do ask them a series of behavioral-based questions. We help them diagnose where they're at. They go out and they talk to their team members to see how well they're already doing this skill, because we want them to understand if they have a gap, right? So this is all about motivation, diagnosing in that prepare phase. In that learn phase, this is where the content goes. And as Steve said, there's a lot of great leadership content out there. We created some e-learning content to go in here. This could be, any number of learning modules or assets that already exist out there about delegating. And then it's this practice phase. This is really key. So using a fairly low technology approach, we actually have Word documents that people download and fill out and guide a conversation that they have with their team about how to delegate. And we ask them to do this 3 times. There is, and then finally you get into this reflection phase. So that's pulling it all together, consolidating it together. You're having these checkpoints with your manager as you go through the journey. So view journey rundown would provide a quick overview, kind of a dashboard view of where I am. My manager also sees my journey rundown, a version of it. And there are shared comments that go back and forth so that my manager can be a touch point for me, because who really is most responsible for helping you develop as an individual? Well, it's your frontline manager. And so we saw that there really was we've got to kind of weave these two together if you want to have a real effective outcome at the end, right? Good results. That's what we're after. So that was one, and one example, and just kind of seeing how the dials are a little bit, they're unique. It's not all the same, and every learning experience you're going to come up with kind of different dials or different meter. So let's take a look at test drive number 2. Completely different than this frontline leaders experience. This is an information security program for an entertainment company. We all have information security challenges, passwords, data protection, social media usage. And when we looked for this client, we had to figure out it was a totally different mix than it was back within the Management Plus experience that we were just showing you. So here we had to really help people see, why does this matter to you? How do you engage them, motivate them to stick through it? How do you help them understand, why this really matters? And then there's a lot of reinforcement. There was some learning, but you can see the diagnose phase. Maybe there's some gaps. You have to identify gaps, but we spent a lot more energy was spent on this engagement phase to pull people in. And a lot of it's because learning the content really wasn't that hard. It's, you're going to be learning about how to change passwords and create complicated passwords and know not to share X, Y, or Z. And then there's this, a lot of reinforcement activities to kind of remind people to floss, keep changing your password. Don't click on fishy links. So what did this experience look like for this organization? Well, they did a lot of, as we said, a lot of engagement activities. So it was a lot of fun. They had a lot of fun, obviously entertainment IP. So they had these 2 characters, Barkley and Fisk, who were, going to go out there and they were going to create the best movie ever made about information security. And they created a few 2-minute short videos that highlighted key principles of social media and information security. And these two bumbling guys kind of did everything wrong. So you kind of learn from the misexample. They created posters and flyers that they put up on campus. They had catchy jingles. They would hand out chocolates that had QR codes that took you to promos for the courses. They took over the cafeteria menus, and just kind of, a lot of this is both engagement and reinforcement, right? So just keeping these messages out front and center. In the learning phase, we created e-learning for them, and, super engaging. We took this comic book theme. They had amazing artwork. We created a storyline around Barkley and Fisk. They're now superheroes, and they're trying to protect the organization from the evil Dr. Zilla Zombot, who's trying to steal your data. And you, the learner, are going to earn your cape and tights as you go through this program and become a member of the Data Defense League by attending Superhero Academy. But ultimately, it was a pretty traditional e-learning experience. We just wrapped this engaging story around it. And they had incredible results. People just said it was unlike any other e-learning experience or the whole experience. They had, when they got out looking at metrics, the real result they wanted to have is they wanted more people calling the compliance department to let them know when something had gone down or if they needed more training. And they had huge results. So they saw a huge uptick in that. And for them, that was the outcome they were after, because it meant more people were paying attention to information security. More people were following through and alerting them if something bad had gone down. And there had been a big, huge breach within the entertainment industry not too long before this. So it was really top of mind and very, very sensitive. And so that reinforcement continued too, and it still continues. In fact, we're updating the program. Originally, the Data Defense League was a few years ago, and now we're updating it with a slightly different theme and approach and look and feel. But the same basic model to get this engagement going. So you can see the dials are going to be really different. And as you go out and think about your own learning experiences, you want to come up with your own mix. You get to be the mix master. And this kind of, asking these questions as you go through can be really useful and helpful, and help you figure out exactly how you want to set the dials on your own individual learning experience. So we are going to get ready to wrap up here. We'll let people go back to their lives, but I just, kind of as a final word, we do a lot of crossing, creating this great program and then crossing our fingers and hoping it's going to be effective. And as Chip Cleary always said, hope is not a method. That's not what should be fueling our training initiatives. We just hope and pray that it's going to work out, right? We want to get results, and we want to have a more effective outcome at the end of the day that's going to influence the business in a meaningful way, so that CEOs are not saying that training is, maybe it's 25% effective, or we're only getting the results 25% of the time. We want that number to go up, and we want people to really see that, hey, we're having an impact on the business.
Yeah, I would just add to that, obviously not today's topic, but obviously there's a lot of movement in the industry around data today. And, if we're creating the right kind of training interventions to move the needle, how do we also collect data and then do the analysis to see, do those two things move in partnership? And that's certainly an area that I think many of us are starting to focus on more and more.
Yeah, great point.
So there's a question here, Cami, which I'll just read out, but which is, you mentioned that the cost of failure is the same as return on investment when one is developing a learning program. Is that? I'm not sure I heard.
That doesn't sound exactly like what I said. I think there was something on the slide about cost of failure, and I was talking about return on investment in terms of what is the outcome that we're after, right? So kind of really what Steve is talking here about with data and analytics. Ultimately, as a training organization, what you want to have an impact is on the business's bottom line. How effective your team members are, how good sales are, how low security or safety issues are. I mean, we have an opportunity in our field to really have an impact on that bottom line for the business. And that's ultimately where, and I'll use air quotes, that return on investment's got to come, because we are having a measurable impact on results. And that's what we're after. So I'm not sure if I conflated the two. If I did, I don't know that I would, because we learn from our failures. And that's really important too. And that can be baked into a training program, is to learn from those mistakes and even highlight those so that we can learn from them.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I'm not sure if we're going down a rabbit hole here, but I think failure is really important to what we do, right? I think often there's fear of measurement, because it might show that we failed, but it's better to know that what we did didn't work and go back to the drawing board and try something new than to assume it worked and have it not work. So.
Yeah, and with that in mind, if we keep a real experimental mindset open at all times, and almost run things as experiments to see what's going to have more impact. To see what's going to have more impact and what's going to have more of a results focus. So think of yourselves as a lab, and you might have to switch the levers on different learning initiatives. Oh, actually, we need more engagement. Let's turn this one up to 11. And there might be some tweaking that you have to do with those. I don't know. It's a sound mixing board, I guess, that picture that we had a little earlier. So thank you so much for your time today. We will, let's see, we've got a guide on this that you can check out, navigating a rapidly changing e-learning market, architecting for results. The link is up here. Steve can put that into, or maybe I can put that into chat.
Got it.
And we will record this session, and this will go out to everyone who registered for today's webinar. And we really appreciate your time today.
Okay, thank you.